In the winter of 1897, nobody in that group was afraid of the Wendigo anymore. They were afraid of each other. By the time they found Thomas Hargrove, he'd been alone for 6 days. Or so he claimed. Fresh footprints in the snow told a different story. Multiple sets. Leading away from where he sat, half frozen against that pine tree. He said he was the last one. The tracks suggested otherwise. This story is based on fragmented records, conflicting testimonies, and one journal that was never fully recovered. The official report called it an incident. The survivors, and there were only 2, called it the winter that never ended. The forest where it happened doesn't have a name on most maps. The locals just call it up north. That's all you need to know, apparently. Up north, where winter doesn't ask permission and the trees grow so thick that noon looks like dusk. 8 people went into those woods in November of 1897. 2 came out in March. What happened to the others depends on who you ask. The authorities said exposure. The indigenous communities nearby said something else. They said the Wendigo came. But here's the thing about the Wendigo. It's not what you think it is. Before we go any further, you need to understand what the Wendigo actually is. Not the version you've seen in movies with antlers and glowing eyes. Not the creature that chases teenagers through the woods. The real Wendigo. The one that comes from Algonquian tradition. The one that's not really a monster at all. The Wendigo is an idea. A warning. It represents something that the Algonquian peoples understood better than most, that isolation, hunger, and winter can turn a human being into something unrecognizable. The Wendigo isn't something that attacks you from outside. It's something that grows inside you. It starts with hunger. Real, physical hunger. The kind that makes your stomach feel like it's eating itself. Then it becomes something else. A hunger that doesn't stop even after you've eaten. A hunger for more. Always more. In the traditional stories, a person becomes a Wendigo by breaking the ultimate taboo. By consuming human flesh. But it's not just the act itself. It's what the act represents. The moment when survival becomes more important than humanity. When you cross a line that can't be uncrossed. The Wendigo is what you become when you choose to live at any cost. And here's the cruel irony, once you become it, you're never satisfied. You're never full. You've traded your humanity for survival, and the cost is that you'll never feel human again. Modern culture turned the Wendigo into a monster movie villain. Something with antlers and elongated limbs that chases people through the snow. It makes for good cinema. It sells tickets. But it misses the entire point. The Wendigo was never meant to be something you could fight with weapons or outrun. It was meant to be something you had to resist within yourself. The creature with antlers is easy to understand. It's external. It's the other. But the creature that lives inside you, that wears your face and speaks with your voice. That's harder to sell. That's harder to watch. The elders who told these stories knew what they were doing. They were preparing their communities for the worst-case scenario. For the winter that goes too long. For the hunt that fails. For the moment when there's nothing left to eat and someone starts looking at the others differently. The Wendigo wasn't a campfire story meant to scare children. It was a psychological immune system. A cultural defense against the unthinkable. So when the survivors of the 1897 expedition mentioned the Wendigo, they weren't talking about tracks in the snow or glowing eyes in the darkness. They were confessing something far worse. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's meet the people who walked into those woods thinking they were prepared for anything. There were 8 of them. James Whitmore, the expedition leader. 42 years old, experienced outdoorsman, confident to the point of arrogance. He'd led 3 previous expeditions and considered himself an expert on winter survival. He wasn't. Thomas Hargrove, the engineer. 36. Practical, methodical, the kind of man who believed that every problem had a solution if you just thought about it logically. He would be one of the two who came back. Robert Chen, the expedition surveyor. 28. Son of immigrants, trying to make a name for himself in a country that didn't always want to give him a chance. Eager. Maybe too eager. Father Benedict Rousseau, the chaplain. 51. There because Whitmore believed that having a priest along was good luck. Rousseau believed he was there to provide spiritual guidance. Neither of them was right about why he was really there. Michael Sullivan, the cook. 47. Cheerful, heavy-set, the kind of man who believed that a good meal could solve most problems. He brought extra supplies. Not enough, as it turned out. Nobody brought enough. William Hayes, the youngest. 23. Fresh out of university, there for the adventure of it. His family had money. He had enthusiasm. Neither would matter. And then there were the Carter brothers. Daniel and Joseph. 30 and 32 respectively. Trappers. They knew the woods better than anyone else in the group, which meant they knew enough to be nervous about the route Whitmore had chosen. They voiced their concerns exactly twice. After that, they stopped talking much at all. 8 people. 8 different reasons for being there. 8 people who trusted James Whitmore when he said he knew what he was doing. 8 people who didn't know that they were walking into something that maps and compasses couldn't navigate them out of. The mistake happened on day 3. Not a dramatic mistake. Not the kind that gets you killed immediately. The subtle kind. The kind that compounds. Whitmore took them west instead of northwest. Only 15 degrees difference. On a map, it barely matters. In a forest where every tree looks the same and the sun barely breaks through the canopy, 15 degrees might as well be 90. By the time they realized something was wrong, they'd lost 2 days. They backtracked. Whitmore insisted they could make up the time. The Carter brothers looked at each other but said nothing. Robert Chen checked the supplies and did some math in his head. He didn't share the results. Then the weather changed. Not snow. Not yet. Just cold. The kind of cold that gets into your bones and makes every breath hurt. The kind that makes you tired just from existing. They set up camp early that day. Father Rousseau led them in prayer. Michael Sullivan made stew with the last of the fresh vegetables. William Hayes made jokes about how this would make a great story someday. Nobody laughed, but everyone wanted to. The snow started that night. Not a blizzard. Just steady, relentless accumulation. By morning, there was 8 inches on the ground. By evening, 16. By the next morning, they couldn't see the trail they'd made the day before. Whitmore made the decision to stay put. Wait it out. The snow would stop. They had supplies. They had shelter. They had time. 2 of those things were true. The snow didn't stop. It snowed for 6 days straight. Not heavily. Just persistently. The kind of snow that doesn't announce itself but buries you anyway. By day 4, they'd used half their firewood. By day 6, they were rationing food. Michael Sullivan stopped making jokes about his cooking. The meals got smaller. The silences got longer. Father Rousseau suggested they pray together each evening. Most of them did, at first. Then fewer. Then just Rousseau, his voice growing quieter each night, as if he wasn't sure anyone was listening anymore. Maybe not even God. On day 8, William Hayes said something stupid. He meant it as a joke. He pointed at Daniel Carter and said, "At least if we run out of food, we've got the biggest guy here to last us a while." He was referring to Michael Sullivan, who was standing right there. Nobody laughed. Daniel Carter stared at Hayes for a long time without blinking. Then he went into his tent and didn't come out until morning. That was the first time someone mentioned the Wendigo. Not seriously. Not yet. Joseph Carter said it quietly to his brother, but Thomas Hargrove overheard. Careful. Talk like that brings the Wendigo. Daniel didn't laugh. He just nodded. Whitmore overheard too. He didn't say anything, but his jaw tightened. He didn't like losing control of the narrative. He didn't like the idea that something in these woods might have more authority than he did. The snow stopped on day 9. By then, it didn't matter. The world outside their camp had transformed into something unrecognizable. Drifts as high as a man's chest. Trees bent under the weight. The trail they'd been following? Gone. The backup trail? Gone. The landmarks Whitmore had been so confident about? Buried. Robert Chen did the math out loud this time. 3 weeks of food left, if they were careful. Maybe 4, if they were very careful. The nearest settlement was at least 2 weeks away. That was before the snow. Now? Nobody knew. We could hunt, Sullivan suggested. Nobody had seen an animal in days. The forest was silent in the way that forests get when every living thing has either migrated or buried itself to wait out the cold. We could forage, Hayes offered. Everything was under 3 feet of snow. Thomas Hargrove suggested they split up. Send the Carter brothers ahead as scouts. Find the trail, or a game path, or anything. Whitmore refused. Nobody separates. That's how people die. The Carter brothers exchanged another look. This time, everyone saw it. They stayed together. They moved slowly, breaking trail through snow that fought them for every step. Progress was measured in yards per hour, not miles per day. The food dwindled. The conversations stopped. The group began to fracture in small ways. Whitmore and Hargrove stopped agreeing on anything. Rousseau prayed more, but quieter, as if he didn't want to disturb anyone. Chen grew distant, doing calculations that he wouldn't share. Sullivan stopped tasting the food he cooked. Hayes stopped making eye contact. The Carter brothers walked at the back of the group, speaking only to each other, in voices too low for anyone else to hear. On day 17, Michael Sullivan sat down in the snow and refused to get up. Not dramatically. Not with an announcement. He just sat. When Whitmore told him to get moving, Sullivan looked up at him with empty eyes and said, "I'm tired, James. I'm just very tired." They couldn't carry him. They barely had strength for their own packs. Whitmore tried ordering. Rousseau tried praying. Hayes tried pleading. Sullivan just sat there, staring at nothing. Finally, Thomas Hargrove knelt down next to him and spoke too quietly for anyone else to hear. Whatever he said, Sullivan stood up. But something had changed. Something had broken. They found a cave that night. Not large, but big enough for all of them. Shelter from the wind. They made camp. They ate. A quarter ration each. Enough to remind their bodies what food was, not enough to satisfy. Father Rousseau tried to lead prayer. His voice cracked on the 3rd word, and he stopped. Nobody asked him to continue. William Hayes didn't wake up the next morning. He was cold to the touch. His lips were blue. His eyes were open, staring at the cave ceiling. Father Rousseau closed them and said a prayer over the body. It took him 4 minutes. Nobody was sure if it was a prayer for Hayes or for the rest of them. They buried him in the snow outside the cave. They didn't have the energy to dig properly, so they covered him and marked the spot with branches. Daniel Carter said they should say a few words. Nobody had any words left. They stood around the small mound for maybe 30 seconds, and then they went back inside the cave because it was too cold to grieve outdoors. That night, nobody slept properly. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind. The settling snow. Each other's breathing. Around the small fire, faces looked gaunt, shadows exaggerating the hollows that hunger had carved. Robert Chen hadn't written in his journal for 3 days. Now he took it out and stared at a blank page for 20 minutes before putting it away without writing anything. Daniel Carter broke the silence. "We're not going to make it on what we have left." It wasn't a question. It was simple mathematics. Thomas Hargrove, ever the engineer, confirmed it. "At current rations, we have 8 days of food. Maybe 10 if we stretch it." "The settlement is at least 12 days away," Whitmore said. "And that's if we don't hit any more storms." The unspoken equation hung in the air. 8 days of food. 12 days of travel. 7 people. 6, if you didn't count whoever would fall next. Joseph Carter stood up abruptly and walked to the far end of the cave. His brother followed. They spoke in whispers that echoed strangely in the confined space. Whitmore pretended not to notice, but his hand kept clenching and unclenching. Father Rousseau broke the silence again, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "There are some lines that a man cannot cross. No matter the cost. No matter." "We know what you're going to say," Whitmore interrupted. "And nobody here is suggesting anything." "I'm not suggesting. I'm reminding. We don't need reminders. We need solutions." Thomas Hargrove stood up. "I'm going to check the perimeter. Make sure the snow isn't blocking the entrance." It was an obvious excuse to leave. Nobody called him on it. Robert Chen followed him out a minute later. Then Sullivan. Then the Carter brothers. One by one, they found reasons to not be in that cave, listening to Whitmore and Rousseau argue about things that nobody wanted to name. When they came back, the argument had stopped. Whitmore was staring into the fire. Rousseau was in the corner, rosary beads moving through his fingers in a rhythm that seemed almost frantic. Nobody asked what had been decided. Because nothing had been decided. Not officially. Not out loud. They left the cave the next morning. 6 of them now. The wind had picked up overnight, erasing their tracks, filling in the grave they'd made. As they walked away, Sullivan looked back once. Just once. Then he turned forward and didn't look back again. 3 days later, Father Rousseau fell. He didn't die. Not immediately. He'd twisted his ankle badly, maybe broken it. He couldn't put weight on it. He couldn't walk. They made a shelter for him, left him some food, and promised to send help when they reached the settlement. Rousseau didn't argue. He blessed them, one by one. When he got to Whitmore, his hand lingered. "I'll pray for you," he said. It didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like a warning. They left him there. What else could they do? They were barely walking themselves. They couldn't carry him. They could barely carry their own weight. Robert Chen wrote in his journal that night, "We left Father Rousseau today. I tell myself we had no choice. I tell myself that when we reach help, we'll send someone back. I tell myself these things because the alternative is unbearable." It was the last entry he ever made. Now there were 5. Whitmore, Hargrove, Chen, Sullivan, and the Carter brothers. The dynamic had shifted. The pretense of leadership had crumbled. Whitmore still walked at the front, but nobody was following him anymore. They were just walking in the same direction because there was nowhere else to go. Sullivan started talking to himself. Not loudly. Just a constant murmur under his breath. Sometimes it sounded like prayers. Sometimes it sounded like recipes. Sometimes it didn't sound like words at all. Nobody told him to stop. The alternative was silence, and the silence had become worse than the muttering. On day 26, they saw something. A shape in the distance. Too tall to be a deer. Too still to be alive. They approached carefully, hope and dread mixing into something nauseating. It was a tree. Just a tree. The wind and ice had shaped it into something that looked almost human from a distance. Almost. Daniel Carter laughed. It was the first laugh anyone had made in weeks. It didn't sound human either. That night, they didn't make a fire. They were too tired. They just huddled together in a depression in the snow, sharing body heat, barely conscious. Thomas Hargrove woke sometime in the middle of the night. The moon was full, reflecting off the snow bright enough to read by. He looked around at the others. Michael Sullivan's eyes were open. He was staring at Robert Chen. Not blinking. Just staring. When he noticed Hargrove watching him, Sullivan smiled. His lips were cracked and bleeding. The smile looked wrong. Too wide. Too empty. Hargrove closed his eyes and pretended to sleep. He didn't open them until dawn. Robert Chen was gone in the morning. His pack was there. His coat was there. But Chen himself had vanished. There were no tracks leading away. The snow around their camp was undisturbed except for the depression where they'd slept. He must have wandered off, Whitmore said. Disoriented. Hypothermic. Nobody believed him. You don't wander away from warmth when you're hypothermic. You burrow into it. But nobody argued. Because arguing would mean discussing other possibilities. Worse possibilities. They didn't search for him. They barely discussed him. They just packed up and kept walking. For now. The number kept decreasing. The mathematics kept getting simpler. That day, they found tracks. Fresh tracks. Footprints in the snow. Leading in the same direction they were walking. Human footprints. For a moment, there was something like hope. Other people. Other survivors. A rescue party, maybe. Then Joseph Carter knelt down and examined the prints more closely. He stood up slowly. He looked at his brother. Daniel looked at the tracks. Then he looked at Whitmore's boots. Then at Hargrove's. Then at Sullivan's. These are ours, Joseph said quietly. From yesterday. They'd been walking in circles. James Whitmore sat down in the snow. For the first time since the expedition began, he had nothing to say. No orders. No reassurances. No plans. He just sat there, a man confronting the fact that his confidence had killed everyone who'd trusted him. Thomas Hargrove pulled out his compass. He stared at it for a long time. The needle's been off, he said finally. I thought it was just the cold affecting it, but we've been navigating wrong for days. Maybe weeks. Why didn't you say anything? Sullivan asked. His voice was strange. Flat. Empty of accusation. Empty of everything. Would it have mattered? Nobody answered. They camped there that night. Where else would they go? Every direction was equally meaningless. The forest had become a maze with no exit. Or maybe they'd already left the forest and entered something else. Somewhere that looked like a forest but operated under different rules. Daniel Carter said it out loud. The Wendigo's here. Whitmore's head snapped up. That's superstitious nonsense. Is it? We're lost. We're starving. We're dying. One by one. And we're starting to. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Starting to what? Sullivan asked. That flat voice again. That empty tone. Daniel looked at him. Really looked at him. You know what? The fire crackled. The wind howled. Nobody spoke. In the morning, James Whitmore didn't wake up. Unlike Hayes, his death wasn't peaceful. His face was contorted. His hands were clenched. His body was curled into a fetal position. Father Rousseau had blessed them before they left him. It didn't seem to have helped. They didn't bury Whitmore. They didn't have the energy. They just moved him away from the camp and covered him loosely with snow. The Carter brothers did this without speaking. When they came back, Sullivan was cooking something. The smell made Hargrove's stomach clench with hunger so intense it was painful. "What is that?" he asked. "Soup," Sullivan said. "Last of the supplies." The three of them ate in silence. It was the first time in days that Hargrove felt almost full. He didn't question it. He didn't want to. After they finished, Joseph Carter stood up and walked a short distance away. They heard him retching. When he came back, his face was pale. Paler than the cold could account for. "Something wrong?" Sullivan asked. "The pack," Joseph said. "Whitmore's pack." "Where is it?" They looked around. The pack was gone. They'd left it with the body. Now both were barely visible under the snow Sullivan had piled over them. "I moved it," Sullivan said. "Consolidated supplies." "What supplies?" Daniel asked. "We just ate the last of them." Sullivan smiled that too wide smile again. "Did we?" Thomas Hargrove stood up so fast he almost fell. He walked away from the camp, into the trees. They heard him being sick. When he came back, he wouldn't look at anyone. "We need to keep moving," he said. They moved. 3 of them now. The number kept shrinking. The forest kept expanding. Or maybe they were shrinking. It was getting hard to tell the difference. That night, Daniel Carter took first watch. He told his brother to get some sleep. Joseph tried. Hargrove pretended to. Neither of them succeeded. Around midnight, Daniel woke them both up. "Sullivan's gone." They searched. Half-heartedly. Hopelessly. Michael Sullivan had vanished as completely as Robert Chen. No tracks. No signs of struggle. Just gone. "Maybe he's the smart one," Joseph said. "Maybe he just walked off to die somewhere quiet." "Maybe," Daniel agreed. But he didn't sound convinced. They were down to 3. The Carter brothers and Thomas Hargrove. 2 trappers who knew the woods and 1 engineer who knew nothing except that everything he'd ever believed about logic and reason had failed him completely. They walked for 2 more days. The forest looked the same in every direction. The sky was gray. The snow was white. The trees were black. That was the entire color palette of their world now. Gray, white, black. And red, occasionally, when someone's cracked lips bled or when someone coughed. On the second night, Daniel Carter shook Hargrove awake. It was barely dark yet, maybe an hour after they'd stopped for camp. "Joseph's talking," Daniel whispered. "Listen." Hargrove listened. Joseph was muttering in his sleep. But it wasn't the delirious muttering of hypothermia. The words were clear. Too clear. So hungry. Still so hungry. Never full. Never satisfied. Need more. Need. Daniel's hand was shaking. "That's not my brother talking." "He's dreaming," Hargrove said. But his voice was uncertain. "No. Something's in him. The Wendigo. It's in him." Joseph's eyes opened. In the twilight, they looked black. Empty. He smiled at them. That same smile Sullivan had worn. "I'm fine," Joseph said. His voice sounded normal. Almost normal. "Just hungry." "We're all hungry," Hargrove said carefully. "No. Not like this. This is different. This is." Joseph stood up. He was steadier than he'd been in days. Stronger. I need to hunt. There's nothing to hunt, Daniel said. There's always something. Joseph walked away from camp. Daniel started to follow. Hargrove grabbed his arm. Don't. That's my brother. Is it? They stared at each other. In Daniel's eyes, Hargrove saw the same thing he felt in his own chest. The knowledge that they'd already lost. Not to the cold. Not to the hunger. To something worse. To the choice between dying and becoming something that couldn't die but wasn't alive anymore either. Joseph came back an hour later. His hands were empty. His eyes were different. Clearer. Colder. He sat down by the fire and didn't say anything. Neither did the others. What was there to say? In the morning, Daniel Carter was dead. Hargrove woke up to find him stiff and cold, lying a few feet away. There were no marks on him. No signs of violence. He'd just stopped. Joseph stared at his brother's body without expression. We should keep moving. We need to, Hargrove started. We need to move. They left Daniel there. They didn't cover him. They didn't mark the spot. They just left him and walked. Two now. The engineer and whatever Joseph Carter was becoming. They walked for a day. Maybe two. Time had stopped meaning anything. There was only walking and stopping to sleep and waking up and walking again. Joseph didn't speak. Hargrove didn't either. Words had become useless. Language had failed. On the third day, or maybe the fourth, Joseph stopped walking. He turned to Hargrove. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but there was an intensity in them that was terrifying because it was too focused. Too present. You're wondering, Joseph said. If I'm going to hurt you. Hargrove didn't deny it. I'm not. I don't need to. Why not? Because you're already like me now. You just don't know it yet. Hargrove wanted to argue. He wanted to deny it. But he couldn't. Because somewhere in the last few weeks, something had changed in him too. The hunger had become something else. Not just for food. For survival. For one more day. For one more hour. For anything. We're both Wendigo, Joseph said. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply a statement of fact. We crossed the line. Maybe we didn't mean to. Maybe we didn't know we were doing it. But we did. I didn't, Hargrove started. Didn't you? The question hung in the air. Hargrove thought about the soup. About Sullivan's smile. About waking up and finding people gone. About not asking questions because he didn't want to know the answers. What happened to them? Hargrove asked finally. The others? The same thing that's going to happen to us, eventually. The Wendigo doesn't let you keep living. It just doesn't let you die human. They walked together for another day. Then Joseph sat down in the snow. I'm staying here. You'll die. I died weeks ago. I just didn't stop moving. Hargrove wanted to argue. He wanted to convince Joseph to keep going. But he was too tired. Too hollow. He nodded and kept walking. He walked alone for 6 days. Or so he would later claim. He walked until he saw smoke in the distance. A logging camp. Civilization. He walked up to the first person he saw and collapsed. They asked him questions. Where did you come from? Where are the others? What happened? He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because how do you explain that you survived? How do you explain that everyone else died? How do you explain the gaps in your memory, the missing days, the things you half remember doing but can't quite see clearly? How do you explain that you're the monster now? They searched for the others. Found Father Rousseau, dead in his shelter, exactly where they'd left him. Found Whitmore's body, mostly covered by snow. Found Daniel Carter. Found nobody else. No Sullivan. No Chen. No Joseph. No Hayes, even though they'd buried him. The official report said exposure. Malnutrition. Hypothermia. A tragic expedition gone wrong due to poor planning and bad luck. Thomas Hargrove was the sole survivor. He'd been lucky. Resilient. Strong. He never spoke about what happened. Not in detail. When pressed, he'd say they got lost, ran out of supplies, and people started dying. The cold got them. The hunger got them. That was all. But sometimes, late at night, when he was alone, Thomas Hargrove would stare at his hands and wonder whose hands they really were. He'd remember the soup. The gaps. The mornings when he'd wake up and someone would be gone. He'd remember Joseph's words, "You're already like me now." He lived for 17 more years. Never went into the woods again. Never felt warm, no matter how hot the day. Never felt full, no matter how much he ate. In 1914, he was found dead in his home. The official cause was heart failure. He was 53 years old. His journal was found after his death. Most of it was mundane. Supply lists. Navigation notes. Weather observations. But the last entry, dated 2 days before they found the logging camp, consisted of only one sentence repeated over and over, filling 3 pages. "I'm so hungry. I'm so hungry. I'm so hungry. I'm so hungry." The other survivor, though this was never documented officially, was Joseph Carter. He was found 2 years later by a group of trappers, living alone in the woods. He didn't speak. Didn't seem to recognize language anymore. He avoided human contact, living on what he could hunt. The trappers tried to bring him back to civilization. He ran. There were occasional sightings after that. A figure in the woods. Too thin to be alive. Too fast to be human. Moving through the trees in winter, seemingly unaffected by the cold. The local indigenous communities knew what he was. They didn't hunt him. They left offerings at the edge of the forest. Not for him. For the thing he'd become. The last confirmed sighting was in 1923. After that, nothing. Maybe he died. Maybe he's still out there. Maybe the distinction doesn't matter anymore. So what's the truth about the Wendigo? Is it a creature that stalks the winter woods? Is it a spirit that possesses the desperate and hungry? Is it just a story people tell to scare each other? Maybe it's none of those things. Maybe it's something simpler and somehow worse. Maybe the Wendigo is just what happens when survival demands too much. When staying alive requires you to become something that isn't really alive anymore. When you save your body but lose whatever made you human. The expedition of 1897 isn't unique. There are dozens of similar stories. Groups that went into the wilderness and came back changed, or didn't come back at all. Some from North America. Some from Siberia. Some from the Andes. The locations change. The details change. But the core story is always the same. People get lost. People get hungry. People start dying. And the survivors become something else. Something that wears a human shape but isn't human anymore. Something that's always hungry but never satisfied. Something that chose to live but lost the ability to remember what living was for. The indigenous peoples who originated the Wendigo story weren't creating a monster. They were creating a warning. A line in the sand. A reminder that some prices are too high to pay, even for survival. They were saying, if you cross this line, you don't get to come back. You might survive. You might keep breathing, keep walking, keep eating. But you won't be you anymore. And here's the thing that should terrify us: we want to believe that we'd never cross that line. We want to believe that we'd choose death over becoming a monster. We tell ourselves that we're better than that. Stronger than that. More moral than that. But Thomas Hargrove probably thought the same thing. James Whitmore probably thought the same thing. Every single person in that expedition probably thought they were different. That they were special. That when tested, they'd pass. They were wrong. And the scariest part isn't that they became monsters. The scariest part is that they probably didn't even notice when it happened. There was no single moment of transformation. No dramatic choice. Just a series of small compromises. A little bit of self-preservation here. A blind eye there. A question not asked. A meal not questioned. A disappearance not investigated. The Wendigo doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask permission. It just grows, quietly, in the space between who you are and what you're willing to do to stay alive. So maybe the Wendigo isn't something that lives in the forest. Maybe it never was. Maybe it just appears when survival demands too much. When the gap between morality and mortality becomes too narrow to navigate. When you realize that staying alive and staying human are two different things, and you can only choose one. And if that's true, then the Wendigo never went away. It's not bound to the winter woods of 1897. It's wherever people are desperate enough. Hungry enough. Scared enough. It's in every situation where someone has to choose between dying with their humanity intact and living as something else. It's in the lifeboat when the food runs out. It's in the shelter when the supplies run low. It's in every situation where the math doesn't add up and someone realizes that not everyone can survive. It's in the moment when someone looks at another person and doesn't see a person anymore. Just a solution to a problem. Just a means to an end. Just another day of survival. The Wendigo is the price we pay for choosing to live at any cost. And the truly horrifying thing is that most people would make the same choice. Not because they're evil. Not because they're weak. But because the will to survive is written into our DNA at a level deeper than morality, deeper than ethics, deeper than humanity itself. Thomas Hargrove survived. But here's the question nobody asked: what, exactly, survived? The man who walked into those woods in November? Or something else wearing his face, speaking with his voice, living in his skin? He never answered that question. Maybe because he didn't know. Or maybe because he did know, and the answer was too horrible to speak out loud. In 1897, 8 people walked into the woods. Officially, 1 came back. But maybe the real number is 0. Maybe they all died in there. And what came out was something else. Something that looked like Thomas Hargrove but wasn't. Not really. Not anymore. That's the real horror of the Wendigo. Not that it kills you. But that it keeps you alive. Keeps you walking. Keeps you breathing. Keeps you eating. And you lose yourself one piece at a time until there's nothing left but hunger and the memory of being human. The Wendigo was never the horror. The forest wasn't the horror. The cold wasn't the horror. The hunger wasn't even the horror, not really. The horror was survival itself. The horror was waking up one morning and realizing you'd do anything to see another sunrise. And then doing it. And then having to live with what you did. And then realizing that living with it means you're no longer the person who would have been horrified by it. There's a reason why the Wendigo stories persist. Why they appear in different cultures under different names. The Wendigo in Algonquian tradition. The Wetiko among the Cree. Similar concepts in Inuit mythology. The I'm ravenous ghosts of Chinese folklore. The Rakshasa of Hindu mythology. Different names, different details, but the same core warning: there are things worse than death. Anthropologists will tell you these are cautionary tales about cannibalism. Survival manuals will tell you about the Andes flight disaster, about the Donner Party, about the siege of Leningrad. They'll explain the psychology of extreme survival situations. The way morality becomes flexible when death becomes immediate. They'll use clinical language. Survival cannibalism. Necessity. Psychological trauma. Post-traumatic stress. But the people who've been there, the ones who faced that choice, they don't use clinical language. They don't talk about it at all, if they can help it. And when they do, their eyes get distant. Empty. Like Thomas Hargrove's eyes in the only photograph taken of him after his rescue. Like he's looking at something the camera can't capture. Something behind the world. The Wendigo isn't a myth created to explain cannibalism. It's a myth created to prevent it. To create a psychological barrier so strong that even in the face of death, people would choose differently. It's a cultural immune system. A defense mechanism against the unthinkable. And like all defense mechanisms, it works until it doesn't. The tragedy of the 1897 expedition isn't that people died. Death in the wilderness was common. Expected, even. The tragedy is that something worse than death happened. The tragedy is that survival became indistinguishable from monstrosity. The tragedy is that the line between victim and perpetrator dissolved completely. Who was the monster in that story? Was it Joseph Carter, who allegedly became something else? Was it Thomas Hargrove, who survived when everyone else died? Was it James Whitmore, whose arrogance led them into disaster in the first place? Was it Michael Sullivan, with his too wide smile and his soup that tasted too good? Or was it all of them? Was it none of them? Were they just people who walked into a situation that no human being is equipped to handle, and did what humans do when all the civilized options run out? The answer is uncomfortable because it implicates all of us. We want to believe we're different. We want to believe that when tested, we'd pass. But the truth is simpler and more terrible: we don't know. We can't know. Not until we're there. Not until we're the ones who are starving. Not until we're the ones watching people die. Not until we're the ones facing the choice between becoming a monster and becoming a corpse. And maybe that uncertainty is the real Wendigo. Not the creature in the woods. Not the possessed cannibal. But the knowledge that under the right circumstances, or the wrong ones, any of us could become something we don't recognize. That the distance between human and monster isn't as far as we'd like to think. That it might be as small as 3 weeks without food. As simple as one impossible choice. As quick as one moment of weakness that compounds into something irreversible. The logging camp that found Thomas Hargrove reported that he kept apologizing. Over and over. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But when they asked him what he was apologizing for, he wouldn't say. Couldn't say. Just kept repeating it like a prayer. Like if he said it enough times, it might undo whatever needed undoing. It didn't work. Apologies don't undo the past. They don't bring back the dead. They don't restore what was lost. They're just sounds we make to convince ourselves that we still have enough humanity left to feel guilt. And maybe Thomas Hargrove kept apologizing because he wasn't sure anymore. Wasn't sure if the guilt was real or if it was just another thing he was performing. Another aspect of humanity he was mimicking because he couldn't remember how to actually feel it. The journal entries are telling. Before the expedition went wrong, Hargrove wrote in detailed, precise engineer's prose. Measurements. Observations. Clear, logical thinking. After they got lost, the entries became shorter. More fragmented. And then they stopped entirely for weeks. When they resume, it's just that one sentence. I'm so hungry. Repeated hundreds of times. Like he'd forgotten every other word in the language. Like hunger had become the only concept he understood. Psychologists have studied the journal. They debate what it represents. Psychotic break. Trauma response. Disassociation. They use their clinical terms and write their papers and present at conferences. But none of them can explain why a man who survived would choose to write that specific sentence hundreds of times in the days after his rescue. After he had food. After he was safe. After the hunger should have ended. Unless it didn't end. Unless Joseph Carter was right. Unless the Wendigo doesn't let you keep living, it just doesn't let you die human. And if you survive, you carry that hunger with you forever. Not hunger for food. Hunger for something you can't name. Something that can never be satisfied because you already consumed the only thing that could have satisfied it, your own humanity. There's a final detail about the expedition that the official reports don't mention. The logging camp that found Hargrove noted it in their private records, but it never made it into the public documentation. When they found him, Thomas Hargrove was walking toward the camp. That's normal. That's what you'd expect from someone who's lost and sees smoke or hears sounds of civilization. But here's the thing, the logging camp was behind him. He was walking away from it. Walking deeper into the forest. And when they called out to him, when they ran up and grabbed him, he seemed confused. Disoriented. Like he didn't understand where he was or what he'd been doing. Like he'd been walking in his sleep. Or like something else had been doing the walking. They brought him back. Fed him. Warmed him. Saved his life. And he thanked them. Said all the right things. Acted appropriately grateful. But the camp foreman noted in his diary, something wrong with that Hargrove fellow. Can't put my finger on it. He looks at you, but it's like he's looking through you. Or past you. At something else. Something we can't see. The foreman was right to be unsettled. Because if the Wendigo is real, not as a creature but as a transformation, then what they rescued wasn't Thomas Hargrove. It was what Thomas Hargrove had become. It was the thing wearing his face. The thing that had learned to mimic humanity well enough to pass. Well enough to fool everyone. Maybe even itself. That's the ultimate horror of the Wendigo myth. Not that you might encounter a monster in the woods. But that you might become one and not even realize it. That you might walk out of the forest thinking you survived, thinking you're still you, while something else puppets your body and speaks with your voice and lives your life. And nobody around you would know the difference. Because the transformation is internal. Invisible. The body looks the same. The face looks the same. The voice sounds the same. But whatever made you human, whatever spark of consciousness and morality and empathy and connection, that's gone. Consumed. Replaced by hunger and the memory of being full. This is why the Wendigo terrifies us in a way that other monsters don't. Vampires, werewolves, zombies, they're all external threats. Things that attack from outside. Things you can fight or flee from. Things that are clearly other. But the Wendigo is internal. It's you. It's what you become when you choose survival over self. When you decide that living matters more than how you live. When you cross a line that you can't uncross and then have to pretend you're still the person who never would have crossed it. In the years after his rescue, Thomas Hargrove tried to live a normal life. He got a job. Made an attempt at maintaining relationships. Went through the motions of being human. But people who knew him said he was different. Distant. Like he was always somewhere else. Like he was performing normalcy rather than experiencing it. He never married. Never had children. Never formed close friendships. He existed on the periphery of society, close enough to pass as normal, far enough that nobody looked too closely. And every winter, without fail, he got sick. Not seriously. Not enough to hospitalize him. Just enough that he'd spend weeks barely eating, barely sleeping, staring out his window at the snow. Like he was remembering something. Or trying to forget something. Or waiting for something to come find him. Maybe that's the real curse of the Wendigo. Not death. Not transformation. But survival. Having to live with what you did. Having to pretend you're still human while knowing you're not. Having to look in the mirror every morning and see a stranger wearing your face. Having to interact with people who trust you, who treat you like you're one of them, while knowing that you're not. Not anymore. That's worse than being a monster. Being a monster is simple. Direct. Honest, in its way. But being something that used to be human? Something that remembers being human? Something that has to pretend to still be human while feeling nothing but that endless, aching hunger? That's torture. That's hell. That's the real horror. And Thomas Hargrove lived in that hell for 17 years. 17 years of pretending. 17 years of going through the motions. 17 years of filling his stomach and never feeling full. 17 years of being alive without being able to remember what living felt like. When he died in 1914, the people who found him said he looked peaceful. Finally at rest. But his landlady, who found the body, said something else. She said his eyes were open. She said he was smiling. And she said, though she never told this to the police, that he looked relieved. Like he'd been waiting for death for a long time. Like it was the only thing he'd wanted since the day they pulled him out of those woods. Maybe death was the only way out. The only way to stop being the thing he'd become. The only way to end the hunger that 17 years of meals couldn't satisfy. So here we are, more than a century later, still telling this story. Still thinking about the Wendigo. Still trying to understand what it means. And maybe the reason we keep coming back to it is because we recognize something in it. Something uncomfortable. Something true. We live in a world where survival is everything. Where winning matters more than how you win. Where success justifies any method. Where the bottom line matters more than the human cost. We celebrate survivors without asking what they survived. We praise resilience without questioning what was sacrificed for it. We valorize strength without considering what weakness was destroyed to create it. And maybe that's our own version of the Wendigo. Not literal cannibalism. But the consumption of everything else. The consumption of morality for profit. The consumption of community for individual gain. The consumption of the future for present comfort. The consumption of others for our own survival. We tell ourselves it's different. We tell ourselves we're not monsters. We use sophisticated language and complex justifications and civilized explanations. But at the core, it's the same choice. The same calculation. Them or us. Their suffering or ours. Their death or our comfort. The Wendigo isn't just a story about cannibals in the woods. It's a story about what we're willing to consume to survive. And in that sense, we're all in the woods. We're all facing the winter. We're all watching the supplies run low and doing math we don't want to do and making choices we don't want to make. The question isn't whether the Wendigo is real. The question is whether we're already becoming it. Whether we've already crossed the line without noticing. Whether we're already the survivors of something that killed our humanity while leaving our bodies intact. And that question doesn't have a comfortable answer. In the end, maybe the moral of the Wendigo isn't don't eat people. Maybe it's something deeper. Maybe it's don't consume more than you need. Maybe it's don't sacrifice others for yourself. Maybe it's don't confuse survival with living. Maybe it's there are some prices too high to pay, even for your life. But we don't want to hear that moral. Because it implies that sometimes the right choice is the one that gets you killed. That sometimes integrity matters more than survival. That sometimes you should choose to die rather than become something that only looks alive. That's a hard sell in a culture obsessed with winning, with surviving, with coming out on top no matter what. We don't want heroes who choose death over compromise. We want heroes who survive against all odds and come home and get their happy ending. But the truth is darker. The truth is that surviving against all odds usually means doing things that happy endings can't accommodate. The truth is that coming home doesn't mean you brought yourself back. The truth is that sometimes the person who walks out of the woods isn't the same person who walked in, and no amount of pretending will make them that person again. Thomas Hargrove tried to pretend. Tried to be the man he was before. Tried to act like survival hadn't cost him everything that made survival worth it. He tried for 17 years. And then he died, with that relieved smile on his face, finally free from the burden of pretending to be human. That's the legacy of the Wendigo. Not the creature in the woods. Not the monster with antlers. But the impossible choice it represents. The line it dares us not to cross. The question it asks us to answer before we're ready: what are you willing to become to survive? And if you become that thing, was survival worth it? The 1897 expedition doesn't have a happy ending. It doesn't have a satisfying conclusion. It doesn't have a clear moral or a simple lesson. It just has this: 8 people went into the woods. Maybe none of them came out. Maybe something wearing their faces came out. Maybe the difference doesn't matter. And maybe that's the only honest way to end this story. Not with answers. Not with resolution. Not with the comfort of understanding. Just with the question. The same question the Wendigo has always asked. When everything else is stripped away, when survival demands everything you have and more, when the choice comes down to living as a monster or dying as a human, what do you choose? We'd all like to think we know the answer. We'd all like to believe we'd make the right choice. But until we're there, until we're the ones starving in the snow, until we're the ones watching people die and knowing we're next unless we do something unthinkable, we don't know. We can't know. And maybe that uncertainty, that not knowing, that's the Wendigo's final gift to us. The knowledge that we're all capable of becoming monsters under the right circumstances. The knowledge that humanity is more fragile than we'd like to admit. The knowledge that the distance between civilization and savagery is exactly as far as your next meal. The Wendigo was never the horror. The cold was never the horror. The hunger was never the horror. The forest was never the horror. The horror was always us. What we're capable of. What we become. What we tell ourselves to justify it. What we carry with us after. What we pretend we didn't do. What we know we did. What we can never undo or forgive or forget. The horror is that Thomas Hargrove survived. And the horror is that surviving might have been the worst thing that could have happened to him. Worse than dying in the snow. Worse than becoming a cautionary tale. Worse than being forgotten. Because surviving meant living. And living meant remembering. And remembering meant knowing. And knowing meant carrying. And carrying meant becoming. And becoming meant never being able to go back to not being. That's the Wendigo. Not a monster you meet. A monster you become. And once you become it, you can never become anything else. You can only pretend. Perform. Pretend some more. Until you die wearing a mask that used to be your face. In 1897, something walked out of those woods. It looked like Thomas Hargrove. It spoke like Thomas Hargrove. It had Thomas Hargrove's memories and Thomas Hargrove's name and Thomas Hargrove's legal identity. But Thomas Hargrove died in those woods. What came out was something else. And it lived among us for 17 years before anyone noticed it was gone. That's the real horror story. Not that monsters exist. But that they look just like us. Because they used to be us. And under the right circumstances, we could become them. The Wendigo is still out there. Not in the forest. In the mirror.